And I'm just going to jump ahead to the end here and tell you that I really did have a moment a few years back where there's a line in a T.S. Eliot poem about, we had the experience, but we missed the meaning. And I think this is a real challenge for anybody, especially a foreigner, because it's happened in China, that you learn the language, you become adept at the culture, you know a lot of the history, and like me, you're a journalist, you're reading books about it, but so what? What does this all add up to beyond giving talks, you know, to interested audiences like yourself? And so the end of this book is me getting involved with trying to preserve headlong, the panda preserve in Sichuan, and I'm working with UNESCO and I'm working with the National Geographic Society, and I'm lobbying local officials to please do not build something they call the panda coaster. They wanted to build a roller coaster, amusement park, and an IMAX theater, and so forth and so on. So that's the end of the book. I'll come back to that in a second, but I want to just bring you back to the very beginning of how I got to China. I'm going to read you the first 2 pages of the book. I'm an unlikely answer to the question asked anxiously by a Chinese writer in 1935, who will be China's interpreters? 60 years later, I arrived by accident after rejecting 6 other countries from the Peace Corps. I was fluent in Spanish and applied after a short stint volunteering at the Texas-Mexico border with the United Farm Workers, hoping to be sent to Latin America. The Peace Corps offered Turkmenistan, Vladivostok, Sri Lanka, and Kiribati. It's not Club Med, it's the Peace Corps, the recruiter finally snapped, after I declined to spend 2 years in Mongolia or Malawi. You don't get to choose. Months passed until one late spring day, the phone rang in the English classroom in Madison, Wisconsin, where I was student teaching. My turf-warring comp ed 9th graders had been ordered to attend an assembly optimistically titled, "We're all in the same gang." I warily picked up the receiver, expecting the vice principal to yell that the students in the local branch of the Gangster Disciples were rejecting the suggestion. Instead, I heard the voice of the all-but-forgotten recruiter, who pronounced a single word with great finality: China. It sounded like a sentence, although really it was a reprieve. I didn't know Peace Corps was in China, I said, twirling the phone cord, stalling for time. In fact, the program had just tenuously begun after its planned 1989 start was shelved following the Tiananmen Square massacre. I was 17 then, and when I heard of the bloodshed via my Beatles car radio, I pulled to the road shoulder and, completely out of character, burst into tears. I didn't know any Chinese people personally, I had never read a book by a Chinese writer, and I could not have found Beijing on a map. But suddenly, a world event had punctured my bubble of enormous teenage self-regard. 6 years later, I knew little about the country beyond the Great Wall, pandas, 1 billion people, fortune cookies, and the indelible image of a man standing in front of a tank. In 1995, China was more of a pariah than a hot travel destination, academic subject, or journalist beat. The country's ascent looked far from guaranteed. What looked preordained was its demise. 1/3 of China's population lived in poverty. The average Chinese worker earned only $500 each year. And 20 years later, that number is $8,000 a year. $500 all the way to $8,000. Less than 7% of people live in poverty, officially, per the World Bank now. Permitting the Peace Corps to send English teachers coincided with China opening its doors to the wider world and its markets. Still, there were limits. When Chairman Mao held power, Chinese propagandists, quite rightly, had condemned the Peace Corps as a tool of American imperialism. Rather than change its verdict, the current regime simply changed the program. Officially, the recruiter said, "You'll be called a U.S.-China friendship volunteer." He paused, and through the phone line, I heard the rustle of papers. I don't know how to say it in Chinese. I couldn't speak the language either, of course. I didn't even know how it sounded. Not only was I wrong about fortune cookies, they're from California, by way of Japan, I couldn't even use chopsticks, but this was it. The Peace Corps' final, take it or leave it final offer, China. Last paragraph. 6 weeks later, I handed the grim border agent the tissue-thin form that asked arriving passengers if they had mental confusion or psychosis, manic, paranoid, or hallucinatory. A connecting flight landed in China's southwest, where I would be posted as an English instructor at a teacher training institute located on a dead-end dirt road at the bend of a polluted river whose name, Tuo, sounded like the spitting that scored Sichuan's streets. The province was 1,000 miles from Beijing, but really a world away in terms of development and engagement with the West. Now here's me when I landed. Now I'm showing you this not to just show the ravages of age, but also to take a note that, many of you might know this, when you get to China, you're rechristened, as it were. My name in English is Meyer, but in Chinese, especially in Sichuan, you pronounce it Mai, to sell R, like R, it's a son. So in Sichuan, Meyer means a son sold in the marketplace by his parents. So my Chinese teacher gave me a new name, Beijing, which I laughed at and hated immediately. And I guess you would Mei is plum blossom, Ying is like Ying Xiong, like heroic, and Dong Fan de Dong, like east, right? So heroic, Eastern plum blossom. And Chinese people always laugh when they hear this name, and oftentimes people will say, that's a girl's name, which always makes me feel sorry for that girl, wherever she may be. But everybody I know in China calls me Meyer. Everybody calls me sold son. The name is official, but didn't stick. And that was a good, important first lesson. Like, there's the official version of you, and then there's the rest of your life, outside bureaucratic control. I want to point out to you before we begin, I didn't know how enormous China was. I'm sure many of you know this, but this is something I often tell Western audiences to begin. We're talking about a country that's equal in land area to the continental United States, and of course is incredibly diverse. I didn't know that when I got there. I thought it was 1.3 billion Chinese marching lockstep to whatever Chairman Mao had once pronounced, right? But there's 150 languages that's in China, 56 ethnic nationalities. John DeFrancis, a famous Chinese linguist, once said, if you ask somebody, do you speak Chinese? It's like asking a European, do you speak Romance? Because there's so many variations, and it's not just dialects, right? It's languages. So, in my Manchuria book, the second book I wrote, I lived on a farm up here near the North Korean border. And in my Beijing book, obviously, I lived in the heart of old Beijing. But this book, I wanted to show American readers, and Chinese readers actually as well, which we'll talk about at the end, just how vast and diverse these hinterlands are. Later after Peace Corps, I worked in Beijing as a journalist, and one of the first things they told me when I got to Beijing, and I worked in Time Magazine's bureau, was there are no new China stories, only new China journalists. Meaning that correspondents cycle through, and they do the story about the college entrance exam, or they do the story about the destruction of old cities, or they do the story about air pollution. But it's very difficult when you're a foreign correspondent to get out of Beijing, out of Shanghai. And not just because they're lazy. I think it's good that correspondents write about what interests them. But there's various bureaucratic and also editorial constraints. Your editors back in New York or Hong Kong are saying readers want this or that or this or that. Whereas I was out here in Sichuan between Chengdu and Chongqing in a town called Neijiang, which means inner river. And then, as I'll talk about, I had lots of time to explore the vast West. This is what my town looked like when I landed in 1995. I show this to remind people that air pollution is not new. I think in many ways air pollution has actually gotten better, especially in the countryside, because people aren't using the coal-burning stoves. But the first thing that I learned when I got here, one of the first words I learned in Chinese was 我好, backward, because people in this area felt that they were living in a backward environment. I didn't experience a great deal of culture shock because I grew up in rural Minnesota. 15 people went in my group of Peace Corps volunteers. 7 of them quit in the first year. You can quit Peace Corps. I urge everybody to join Peace Corps because you get a free ticket. If you don't like it, they'll send you home in a few days. But the people who quit, the 7 people who quit, all had lived in Taiwan, Beijing, or Hong Kong. So for them to come out here to the middle of Sichuan, this was like, this isn't the China we know. Whereas to me, this is how I landed. And I'm bringing this point up too because I find all of us involved with China have our Rosetta Stone moment. If you lived in Beijing before Tiananmen, you have a certain experience. If you lived in Shanghai or Guangzhou or Wuhan, you have a different experience. It's based on geography and also the era you lived in. For me to be out in the middle of nowhere in Sichuan in '95, that informed how I see the country and everything that I've done since. One of the things, that I have to check myself all the time is that when I got there, your eye is always drawn to the exotic. And so your eye is always drawn to something that you don't have back home. And I remember, this is at the Tea Garden in People's Park in Chengdu. I remember being very taken by the handmade bamboo chairs, And again, from the locals' perspective, saying, no, this means we're poor. This doesn't mean we're crafty. This doesn't mean that we have great culture. This means we can't afford factory-made products, right? And so one of the things too, I always have to check myself now, especially talking to editors, is that a lot of us, myself included I think, have this vision of China as sort of this, you know, the samovars on the train, the tea thermoses you have in hotels, handmade ping pong tables, handmade chairs. And then maybe for me, my understanding leaks because a lot of my students went on to Dongguan and Shenzhen to make iPhones, but it's especially difficult for me now, living in Pittsburgh next to Carnegie Mellon University, to see all the artificial intelligence and robotics that's going on in China, because those delegations are constantly coming to Pittsburgh, back and forth between CMU and Beijing. And so again, I feel in some ways, my understanding of China is in a way out of date already. I'm scrambling to catch up with this. I no longer, when I go on reporting trips, want to go to Beijing. I want to go to Shenzhen. I want to go to cities where a lot of the robotics is happening and high technology. Now, when I got there, this was the Tuo River. You know, there was no bridge. It was this sort of grim 5-story walk-up buildings. It was the birth of a market economy, so there was a toll on the bridge. This is a little hard to see, but this bridge, you pay a toll based on how many legs you have. So people paid 2 mile, but horses and ponies and donkeys and pigs and chickens all had different tolls for the farmers that were taking their produce across the bridge to market. The other thing about it, you know, when I got there, the college really didn't know what to do with me. I was the first American they had seen. I was 23 years old, and I remember the Waiban, you know, the head of the foreign, what would you call the Waiban? Your foreign agent, your foreign handler?
Office.
Yeah, foreign affairs guy. He, you know, he looked at me and he said, I want you to teach the students a couple things. And I said, okay, and I'm bracing myself. And he said, all I want, in their first year here, could you teach them the Bible, the Enlightenment, the stock market, and the Beatles? And I said, okay, got it. And I said, what? And he said, you can talk about Tiananmen because the students know the truth about that. You know, they're not going to listen to a foreigner's interpretations of things, right? He's an over the party. But then he also looked at me one day after the first couple of weeks and he said, you're tall. And I said, yeah. And he said, basketball. And I said, yeah. And he said, you play? I said, sure. He said, well, we have a college team. And we think you should be our starting center. And now again, I joined the Peace Corps out of Madison, Wisconsin, having come from United Farm Workers, thinking I was going to be doing this great development work. I was going to be birthing babies in the moon glow. Luckily for the babies, I wasn't doing that. But instead, they put me on the team. And I remember saying to them, like, there must be a rule that foreigners can't be on the team. And he laughed, you know, that knowing laugh. And he said, we've never had a foreigner here. So no one thought to put it in the rules that a foreigner can't be on the team. So again, this is another lesson for China early on, right? Never ask for permission, always ask for forgiveness, you know, afterward. This was our gong at halftime, I love. We never lost in 2 years, by the way. Another thing I want to say though too is that I started writing a lot. You know, Peace Corps doesn't allow you to publish. They don't want you doing blogs or sending newspaper articles home. They really want to control your message. And it's funny because, as maybe you probably know, a lot of Peace Corps China writers did go into journalism. They wrote about their experiences while they were there. Peter Hessler, for example, Rob Schmitz, who's now the NPR correspondent, they were part of my group as well. But in the early going, you know, I was writing for a Wisconsin newspaper, for a Minnesota newspaper, and so forth. I was sending dispatches home. And again, a lot of the things I was writing about when I look back, I'm sort of embarrassed about. And I write about this in the book, that when you come to understand a culture, again, your eye is drawn to the exotic, the cute, the funny. It takes a lot longer to get deeper into it. There's a learning curve here, right, which I eventually made. Another thing about my students, I'll say, I was in an interesting era in '95, and that this group of students was the first group at this university. It was a teacher training college, now it's officially a university, were paying students. They were not exam entered students, right? So they were paying their own tuition to learn English, learn a trade, and go out and find their own job. And so it was an opportune moment for a foreigner to be there too, because just as I was confused about how to live in Sichuan, these students were just as confused. They didn't have a state-provided job waiting for them. They had to figure out how to rent an apartment. That was a new thing. How to get a beeper. Beepers were just coming in. You know, all these new changes. So it was comforting to know that they were just as bewildered as I was. And in the book, I followed what happened to many of them. I have to say, you know, I've written 3 books about China now. I've interviewed thousands of people, I'm sure, over the years. I don't have a lot of tragic stories in my books. And part of me feels bad about that in a weird way. Maybe they're living lives of quiet desperation, in the middle class, I don't know. But for the most part, and I guess I'm an optimist anyway, because I'm a teacher, but the people I've written about over the years have all gone on to live quite adjusted, happy lives. There hasn't been I haven't had a muckraking story to tell yet. Now, when I was there, you did start seeing the Western influence coming in, the first Kentucky Fried Chicken, Marlboro cigarettes over the archway here. And then you also saw, too, I was right there at that era when fish glue stamps were going out, right? That now everything was computerized. But I like this, too. At the time, I remember thinking, here's these beautiful old traditional Chinese houses and traditional art, and then here's the things that's tearing them down, to make it. But again, in those 20 years, at the time, if you had told me this, I would have laughed. But 20 years from those stamps being issued, from 97 to 2017, China's constructed more highway expressway than America has in some. China has constructed more high-speed rail than the rest of the world has combined. I wish somebody at that time, remember The Graduate, where they say to Benjamin, like, plastics, the one word? I wish someone had just told me, cement. Just invest in cement and you'll be rich. I should have known. I want to show you a picture of some of the changes going on in Sichuan in the last 20 years too. This is in Chongqing. This is at Ciyunci. This is a monastery on the Yangtze. It's a nunnery. I'm looking out at the river here from the ledge. There's boats, going through the three gorges. That's where they dock. And here's the city proper itself. Again, this is 1996, so the air was lousy even then. If you've been to Chongqing, you know it's very much a sauna. This is sort of, I tried to get the same viewpoint, but it was hard. This is sort of similar, though, looking across the Yangtze to downtown 20 years later. That's the arc, and this is the challenge as a writer. How in the world do you encompass this dramatic shift from that? It's funny, Chinese cities look so pretty at night, always. They look much better at night. I do want to say, though, I guess my way in this book is to keep it small. I try to shrink it down to personal stories and personal experiences. This is my campus when I arrived in 1995, and then this is it after it had become a university. I like that there's a lawn that you can't go on, palm trees, because palm trees look pretty. But I do want to point out, in the back of my university was fields of rapeseed, as far as you could see, bright yellow blossoms, and these old traditional houses, which, as I read about in the Beijing book, they're very pretty to look at, but they're awful to live in, right? Poverty may be picturesque, but it's horrible to actually inhabit. And so part of me, I'm going to show you this next picture with sort of a mixed heart, because I remember these houses with the mud floors and the rats and the leaking roofs and the horrible clammy air in wintertime. But when I look out the back of my campus and I see this, I start to wonder if maybe the rapeseed wasn't better at these houses. But this is what it looks like now in Zhejiang. Now, Zhejiang, when I lived there, was a city hardly anybody in China even knows about. Zhang Daqian, the famous painter whose calligraphy is hanging in the office here, that's his hometown. But other than that, this town went from 500,000 people to over 2 million. I'm sure many of you know that China's trying to urbanize at the same rate America has urbanized. One way China's doing that now is simply redrawing municipal borders. So in the old days, our campus was outside the Zhejiang city limits, across the river. Well, now they've simply just drawn the border bigger. In a way, it's good because city teachers are assigned to teach farm kids, farther and farther out. But it's also opened up all this farmland here for development. And I think in the statistic I came up with in the last 10 years, China has taken farm area the size of New York State and turned that into high-rise houses like these. Now again, from my perspective as an American, I look at this and I go, ugh. And I remember telling a Beijing city planner once, an official, you don't have to make the same mistakes America's made. And the official got very indignant and said, we have every right to make the same mistakes that America made. And you're sort of seeing it here. At the same time, though, on the ground, people are quite happy with this, right? They have hot water, they have AC in the summertime, it's much easier to have a child. And also, as you know, Chinese, especially if you're coming from a rural background, coming into becoming a city folk, a city citizen, as it were, this becomes your nest egg. Chinese don't have pension funds and mutual fund investments the way people in the States do. And so that apartment becomes your nest egg. It gives you equity that you can buy and sell and use as collateral to get other mortgages. And moreover, I find a lot of families here, they buy 3 or 4 of them together. So mom and dad are next to them to help raise the child and so forth. So it's not as sinister, I guess, or awful as it looks like from above. This is what the city looks like today. This is Zhang Daqian, the famous painter who fled Meijing during the Civil War and went to Taiwan. He was here at the China Institute for a spell. Like I said, there's calligraphy of his here. I really like his museum because Zhang Daqian was a master forger. He's famous for doing fake paintings. And in fact, he sold paintings to the Metropolitan Museum here in New York that only years later did he admit were fakes, right? And so when you go into Zhang Daqian's museum now, they very proudly tell you, all of these are fake. Everything in here is fake. He's a master forger. The other thing I want to say about this too is that, you know, even in the 1930s, Pearl Buck was writing stories about the transformation of Chinese cities, especially Nanjing, where she had lived. And she was saying a lot of the urban planners had graduated from UCLA, from Columbia. They came to China in the 30s, and they made the cities look like American cities, wide boulevards and so forth. And that certainly has been true up until recently. And I'm just showing you this because this is Meijing. This is a little hinterland Sichuan town that had urban planners go abroad, mostly to the States, come back and say, you know, we should really do more about protecting the environment here. So that horrible brown, river that was really polluted, they routed the river under the city, so it goes and hooks up with the Yangtze further away from the city. They turned the central part of the river into a reservoir. They planted trees and wetlands all along the banks, and then they put a series of bike paths in with, bike share stands all throughout. So again, this is Meijing. So again, I'm showing these because I find it's really easy to criticize China's development, because development in China often looks like destruction. But there are some better things going on too, I think, as far as smart cities and so forth. So back to our map here. I had a lot of time in the Peace Corps. They really didn't know what to do with me. I was isolated from our main office. Our medical kit consisted of 2 packs of Gatorade, 2 clean syringes, and a big paper bag full of condoms, which was like a sick joke, So my students used to blow them up and throw them around the room and so forth. But we had really no contact and no supervision. So I was playing basketball, I was studying Chinese like crazy. I learned Chinese by writing pinyin on my arms. And I kind of looked like Spider-Man when I'd go into a restaurant and say, 我要面条. I didn't know at the time that I was learning Sichuan Hua. So years later, when I moved to Beijing people would listen to me and say, what are you? Like, it would be like a Chinese person that came to Louisiana or something learning, because in Putonghua you say, 多少钱? In Sichuan you say, 好多钱? In Putonghua you say, 你说什么? In Sichuan you say, 啥子嘛你啊? Everything is, I love it, right? It's really melodic. But it's 美国, not 美国. Everything is that. I was shouting instead of 不知道 and so forth. So that's the dialect I learned. When I came to Beijing, I had to relearn everything all over again. And now I actually have an exaggerated Beijing accent. I'm hyper-correcting, trying to get rid of the Sichuan. But I like the Sichuan a great deal. I had a lot of time, like I said, and travel in China is cheap, as you know, and train travel is cheap. And so for a lot of those 2 years, I was spending time along the Vietnam border, the Laos border, Myanmar, into Tibet. It was really easy to go to Tibet back then. You could hitchhike on trucks and so forth before the train came in. Qinghai and Xinjiang. And so a lot of this book actually, because my first book is about Beijing, and my second book is about this entire region of Dongbei, or Manchuria. For this third book, I wanted to cover sort of the rest of the country, the part that correspondents don't get to a lot, and talk about the history and the differences and the diversity out there. And one of those things that if you've been out there, like you're out in the Himalayan foothills, and all of a sudden, this image of 1.4 billion now, 1.3, 1.4 billion people, crowded cities, pollution, really fades away. You see this this other China, as it were, this ethereal landscape, wide open spaces. This is in Tibet, when I was the only person on this ferry going across the Lhasa River out in the middle of nowhere. But along with that too, as I mentioned earlier, was this diversity. Realizing that Han culture isn't necessarily all of Chinese culture. Later on in my life in China, I worked with UNESCO to train World Heritage Site managers. So the manager of the Patala Palace, the Suzhou Gardens, stuff like that. I would do workshops about preserving a sense of place. And I'd have the president of Yosemite come over and talk to park people about how you preserve your parks and so forth. And after a while, China is collecting UNESCO World Heritage Sites like actors collect Oscars. China now has the second most in the world. They're one behind Italy. They really want to pass Italy. I think Italy has 57. China has 56. They're really upset. Just like the two countries battle over who invented noodles, China or Italy. But it got to the point now with UNESCO, and you'll notice now when you look at the sites that are being inscribed on the World Heritage List, UNESCO finally told China, stop putting Han culture sites up for nomination. We want to see Korean, Manchu, we want to see different, of all these ethnicities that you say with great pride that you have, we want to see their culture, which is a bit tricky because a lot of minority culture in China isn't allowed to be taught in schools, the languages aren't preserved the way even English is being taught. Along those lines too, I was really surprised, having come from the US-Mexico border with United Farm Workers, to China, that China has a border. Of course China has a border. China has more countries bordering it than any other country in the world. But, when we talk about the border in America versus how Chinese talk about their border, it's a very different conversation. This is a country of immigration, obviously. In China, it's not. And I was surprised, to be like, this is in Rayleigh, this is on the border with Myanmar, or Burma. But the border was very porous. People could come and go quite easily. And I found this on the North Korean border too. And it's one of the things that, we hear so much about North Korea. We don't often hear about North Korea from a Chinese perspective, which is that border with North Korea is 800 miles long. That's from San Diego all the way to El Paso. You imagine our border, that link, right? And so people in the Northeast, for example, in China, will often talk about North Korea not like they're afraid of a nuclear bomb. They're afraid of a vast humanitarian crisis, people pouring over the border. Because even in a village I was living in when I was writing the second book about a rice village, there were pockets of North Korean refugees living illegally. There was sort of an open secret, right? And they asked me not to write about them. But these gentlemen are coming, they came over the border from Burma. And again, at the time, this was the late 90s, it was a more open exchange border, and this was the first time I heard the term the Chinese dream. These guys were saying, well, China is an economic magnet for people around its borders. One of the things I write about in this book that surprises me, though, is that China does not take in refugees. I don't know if you know how many refugees America takes in every year. Under Obama, it was 140,000. President Trump recently raised hell by saying he wanted at most 60,000. Right now, China officially on its books has 583 refugees being processed. They have more billionaires officially on the Forbes rich list. And so there have been, movements from Vietnam into China during the border war in '78 and '79. But for the most part, as you know, China remains this attempt at a monoculture. We used to hear a lot about Tibet. I don't know where Tibet went. It's not in the media conversation anymore. One of the reasons for that may be because journalists are forbidden to go to Tibet. It used to be more of a topic to write about, to be aware of. I remember when I came back from China, I was in grad school at Berkeley, I was teaching in Oakland, and I would see people wearing the free Tibet shirts, and I always wanted to see when I'd say, free Oakland, because the public schools were so lousy, like let's focus on our own community. But at the time when I went in the late 90s, Tibet was much more open, and it's this push-pull with the Communist Party and minority groups, or ethnic minorities, I should say, that even as early, this is from 2004, you could buy pictures of the Dalai Lama with the Panchen Lama around Lhasa markets and temples. There's that elasticity that happens with Chinese political leaders, where someone will be appointed to be the head of a province. We'll have an iron fist rule sort of thing, like in Xinjiang right now, Muslim men cannot grow beards. Internet traffic is halted, texting is hard to do, and so forth. In the early 2000s, Tibet was quite different, and it was an era when there was actual talk that the Dalai Lama might sit down with Jiang Zemin, who was the then leader, and have a summit about what to do with the future of Tibet. That hasn't happened, obviously. It's gone the complete opposite way. This is in front of the Potala Palace now. See, there's a Chinese flag, soldiers, and the main street in front of the Potala Palace is called Beijing Lu. It's Beijing Road. It's gone the complete opposite way. And this is something I wasn't expecting, and I write about in the book. My entire early years in China, I thought, well, this can't last. The party can't stay in power. People won't stand for this. I was completely wrong about that. And I was in Berlin last month, and I was at the Stasi Museum, and the great, the old Berlin Wall remnants and stuff, and people were saying, but we thought the same thing. we thought our life was always going to be this way, and then one day it flipped. I just don't see that happening in China, not with the gains that the younger generation and the middle class have made right now, especially in terms of property ownership, freedom of travel, a different freedom of information, maybe not as open as it used to be. I'm just going to show you a few more slides here, and then I'll stop and take questions. But when I ended in Peace Corps, maybe some of you have had this experience. After those 2 years were up, I kind of felt like I had to stay in China. Most Peace Corps people, if you go to Jamaica or Kenya or Mongolia, the poor people who go to Mongolia, they were always depressed, leave. And you don't really use your language, or you don't maybe stay as connected to your community as you once were. But a lot of the China people stayed on. Mostly men, I have to say, because especially in the 90s, it was much more of a bro culture. Some of the female volunteers have warned me, don't talk about, China was a great place to stay on and work. Maybe it was for guys, but it wasn't as easy for women to do that. But after my 2 years were up in Sichuan, I thought, I've got this language now I'm learning. I've traveled a lot. I'm interested in history. I want to write more. And so I moved to Beijing. And like I said, people thought I was a freak when I opened my mouth. Beijing traffic was always bad. This is a picture from the late 90s. And when I was talking to a city official, he explained to me, you have to understand, we add to our GDP by tearing things down as well as building them. And so you always, I always write about this, about how you'll see a road will be torn up. And then 2 years later, they'll tear it up again. It's like, well, we're cycling through. We're keeping people employed. We're buying materials and so forth. It's a way to pump prime the economy. I was a complete dork when I first got there. I did the silly things like go to Tiananmen Square and look for tank treads, which you could still see at the time. It's a terrible place to rollerblade. That was a dumb idea. I don't think it's funny to stand in front of Cherry Mountain and point like that. But this is, I was in Sichuan. They say "shanglalao," "shangsharen." I was a countrysider coming to the big city. And like I said, it really informed how I saw China. Because most people in Beijing look at Sichuan and say, oh, that's Lehou, that's backward, they're weird. I thought Beijing was the outlier. My whole experience was in the Sichuan countryside, but that generation and that environment, coming to Beijing, was quite odd. I did, though, have a nice experience. If you've been to Tiantan, the Temple of Heaven, you might know this, the Hui Bi, the echo wall. It's a round brick wall that if you lean in and you whisper, your voice travels all the way around the other side. And I immediately, I was like, I glommed onto that. I thought, okay, that's what this city is. This city is one big echo wall. It's 600 years, even longer before that. But it's a constant cycle of people putting their mark on it, that echo circling back around, maybe tearing things down, but still the essence of Beijing still stands there. When I first lived in Beijing, I lived out in a farming area in the far northwest beyond the old Summer Palace. And within the first year, that was gone. I taught at a very interesting school that taught everything bilingually and biculturally. So I taught the students in English about ancient Rome. Rome was a glorious culture that had great feats of engineering. And then my Chinese co-teacher would talk about ancient Rome in Chinese from a Chinese perspective. Rome was built on the back of slaves, and so the children got this really interesting bifurcated education. And these kids have all gone on, it's disheartening to me how old I feel, because now they're PhD students and in state departments around the world and so forth. But I would walk to school, and this was so different than Sichuan. I'd walk to school, and one day that hutuan would be gone, and there'd be this. And I would ask the archaeologist standing there with his mesh hat on, what are you doing? And he said, oh, we found these tombs, they're from the Han Dynasty. And I would do the math. Well, that's 200 AD. Oh yeah, we just gotta see if there's anything in them, and then we're gonna fill them in, and we're gonna build apartments on top of them. And I'd say, no, you have to preserve it. He said, yeah, you Americans, we could stick our shovel here and find something older than your country. I said, that's true, but in America we stop and preserve it. I don't think there's anything honorable in saying, oh yeah, we dug it up, now let's fill it back in again. But again, it made me start thinking really hard about what do I want to write about Beijing? Do I want to write about culture, or do I want to write about this history that's sort of regenerating itself? And the reason I ended up calling my first book The Last Days of Old Beijing is that you realize when you're in China, there's been a last days of old Beijing about every 100 years. Beijing has cycled through history this way, where things are built, things are destroyed, things are built, things are destroyed. Some things are preserved, and some things are not. one of the things that was challenging for me as a teacher in Beijing, and was really similar to the countryside actually, is, all museums tell stories, but in China, museums tell political stories. Everything is a march toward communist liberation. That's the result. It was difficult to teach my high school students, for example, about the Cultural Revolution. But again, officially, if I were a journalist, I'd say there are no museums for the Cultural Revolution in Beijing, but there are. You can go, there's just an entrepreneur who started a restaurant. She took a lot of old newspapers and paintings and badges and menus and so forth from the Cultural Revolution. So you could find this history sort of outside the official channels. And I found that throughout China. Like when I lived in the Northeast, people often say to me like, oh, the Chinese really hate Japan. I said, well, it's more nuanced than that. And I remember going to a site on a river where a local historian had wanted to put a plaque up. And I said, why? And he said, because on this site, Japanese women who had been sent here by their government to farm the land of the Northeast were stranded. The Japanese army had pulled out in 1945 in August. The Russians were coming in. These Japanese women were on this riverbank. They put their babies on the shore and they stepped in. And 2,000 of them were washed down the river. And our village adopted the children. And there's a big cemetery there with the Japanese, infants and so forth. And he said, listen, Japanese were also victims of that war, of Japanese fascism, and we should commemorate that. And there's always these little cracks in windows where I hear from him where it's like, the government's going to approve the plaque. And then that window shuts again, right? And so I find this too, like this Cultural Revolution restaurant doesn't exist in Beijing anymore. Now you can go to Lao She, the writer, you can go to his house in Beijing and sort of learn about the Cultural Revolution. But it's too simple to say Chinese don't care about their history or Chinese don't want to talk about the past. Yes, maybe not officially, but you can still find it if you look hard enough for it, that people are eager to talk about this history. So as a writer, for a writer that was Nana. I took my students to Confucius's grave, which at the time was very sparsely touristed. This was before the Communist Party is sort of picked up Confucius's teachings and put them forward again. You see, when I was teaching in schools, you'd see lots of Marx and Deng Xiaoping quotes. Now you see Confucius quotes in the classrooms. North Korea, I mentioned the border. The other thing about writing about history in China that's always intriguing to me, and I like the challenge, this is on the Yalu River in Dandong, which is the border town. That's North Korea. I like the Ferris wheel that never turns. There's a railroad bridge there on your left, and then the bridge we're standing on has a dotted line to the North Korean side, right? And that's because in 1950, during the Korean War, Truman told MacArthur, don't you dare cross into Chinese airspace. We don't want to start World War III, which MacArthur very much wanted to do. And so instead, these Navy pilots for 3 days flew about 400 flights into Chinese flak, shooting at them, and bombed exactly half the bridge. It only went out, into the North Korean side. Now, when you're standing on the bridge, there's a little plaque that says, the bridge was bombed by American pilots in 1950. That's all it says. So, my job as a writer then is to say, well, there's got to be more to the story than this, and to dig into the military history and learn the pilots. They'd have to dive at such a deep angle. They would put their landing gear down to slow their airplanes, drop the bombs, and get out. But then to extend that story further, I found a 16-year-old Chinese soldier who remembers the battle because he was sitting on this side of the river, and he said, we were just waiting for the river to freeze. They dropped the bridge, and about 6 days later, the river froze. 130,000 of us walked over to North Korea and changed the war. Right? And so again, as a writer, I always like this about China, but this is the challenge, to look beyond what's being presented to you and go a bit deeper into that narrative. I'll just show you a couple more slides, and then I'll stop. The other big thing that was going on, in my era, as far as sort of changing my understanding of the country, was that China has spent more years dismantling its Marxist economy than it spent building a Marxist economy. Right? There's probably more Marxists in Berkeley than there are in Beijing. But you would see this even in the hinterlands at the time, this notion that you better work hard today or tomorrow you'll be looking hard for work. And then, take that even forward. This is a very recent photo from Xinjiang in the Northeast with one of the last big statues you see to Chairman Mao in the country. And these people are actually praying to Mao. They're leaving flowers. They're praying for jobs. Now again, as a writer, you go, okay, well, is that exotic? Is that odd? But I stayed here and I watched, and throughout the day, people would come up leave flowers, say something, bow, and go away. Because Xinjiang was the heart of the state-owned enterprise economy, which is being dismantled or being reshaped, I should say. And then the other thing about culture, again, the big change I've seen in the last 15 years especially, is Beijing telling regions, you're on your own to raise your own revenues for social services. And the way a lot of regions have done that is turned to tourism, as you know, and developed a domestic tourism agency around patriotic tourism, red tourism, but also attracting foreigners to these colonial sites that were once looked at shamefully. This is in Harbin, which was a stop on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, built at the turn of the 20th century. Sort of looks like these buildings, got on the train in Paris and got off. But even something like this is St. Sophia's Cathedral in Harbin. When I first visited this in 1998, you couldn't see the cathedral from the street because there was block housing around it. And if you went through the housing, you can even see the old Cultural Revolution painting on it still, the yellow there. But it had all been boarded up and it was being used as a warehouse for a department store. But now Harbin has to generate tourist revenue, so they've gussied up the church. It's not consecrated, it's a museum, it's not a working church anymore. But again, that extends to Japanese architecture too, which really surprises me. This is in Changchun, which was the capital of Manchukuo, the puppet state from 1941 to 45. And I asked the city mayor here, why do you keep this? And he said, people like to roller skate in front of it. Maybe that's true, maybe not. It does draw tourists. I like the Japanese pine in front of it. But again, that preservation was going on to the detriment of what I would call more authentic, or I should say native heritage sites. This is the end of the Great Wall out in the Gobi Desert, past Jiaoyuguan, the very, very westernmost end of it. I probably shouldn't be sitting on it. But this was still a time where you could go to these places and no one was selling tickets, no one was selling you socks or water. They would just be there. And this would drive the UNESCO people crazy. Why isn't this being rehabilitated? Well, it's in a Muslim region and a lot of tourists come out there and so forth. That's changing now. But again, you would travel in places, this is in the middle of Shanxi, where you would travel these temples here from 700 AD. This is Foguangsi, joined together with dowels, the oldest extant wooden building in the world, protected because it was too far away for Red Guards to reach. And in these towns like that too, you would still see traditional heritage, like opera. In the book, I talked to a writer named Feng Jicai. He's a Chinese writer who's based in Tianjin, and he scrambles to write down disappearing songs, folk tales. He said he feels like it's the Song Dynasty. The Song Dynasty was very good at writing down everything because the Mongols were coming. So if you want to know about recipes, architecture, music, folklore, and so forth, the Song Dynasty has records of it. And now I find that older activists especially are doing this. And he said, I know I'm in trouble when I drive out to a mountainous town and I want to collect folk tales and I see TV satellite dishes. Because the minute people are starting to watch television, like The Voice, that singing show is very popular there, they're going to start losing the traditional, more regional culture. Not all culture is worth preserving. This is a cockfight out in Xinjiang and Kashgar. But the government has been very sensitive to preserving local culture in many places. So in Kashgar now, when you have a cockfight, you have a referee. He's asleep here. And then the roosters have rubber bands on their talons so they can't actually hurt each other. And these guys are the handlers that call the fight. So that's being preserved as well. But again, it's very, very different. This push and pull between what should be preserved and what should be let go is this ongoing conversation that I'm most interested in, far more than I am interested in the politics and even the economy. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to take any of your questions. Thank you. Manny, do you want to?
Yeah. Can you find Chinese opera all over China or only in certain places?
That's a really good question. Oddly enough, 10 years ago it was harder to find it than it is now. Now you'll see regional opera houses in Hong Kong, in Guangzhou, in Beijing. There's a few in my old neighborhood near Dashilar here, because the government actually has the thing under Xi Jinping of like intangible cultural heritage is a big thing they're promoting. So there's money for this. Whereas in the past, like 20 years ago, it would have been like, let's have a symphony, let's have an orchestra, and now there's a turn back to. The problem is though, it's a lot like temples. Buddhist temples are being preserved and opened and refurbished and so forth, but most people want to send their children to the public school where they're going to learn Chinese and English rather than become part of the clergy, right? And so it's difficult, I think, for performers to be found, like to train, because a lot of the opera, you start quite young, become an apprentice and so forth. But they're there, yeah. Yeah, in the back.
Yes, thank you for your exposition, very nice. Two questions. One is, why Tibet?
Yeah.
I know that historically there's some common trunk. Why does the central government persist in holding on to or making a claim on Tibet?
I mean, you're right, and this is the other thing too I put out in the book. A lot of China's, what we call current hotspots or disputes predate the Communist Party, right? That in the Republican era too, Tibet had a moment of being, flying its own flag and so forth. And Tibet was, the communist, the line is that there's been exchanges between Tibet and China proper dating back hundreds and hundreds of years, right, back to the Yuan dynasty. And then during the Qing dynasty especially, the Manchus who ruled all of China really promoted religion of different kinds, right? And so you have monasteries in Inner Mongolia and so forth. Now, that's a good question, why now? I think it's akin to America demanding Texas at one point. It's a secure area on the border. It's also a vast treasure house. There's a lot of natural resources in Tibet. And so I don't think it's a question of the communists saying, well, it's ours now. I think in their minds it always has been, but in 1951 it really became that way. But that's a good question. What I'm interested in, what happened to it? Where's a good book of contemporary report? I don't know what's going on in Tibet right now, and I'd really like to know. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, what was your second question?
Yeah, on a wider frame, in many countries, I come from Puerto Rico, tiny little island, and I've always had the suspicion that when places anywhere around the planet, you have small groups of people trying to preserve an ancient item, or a particular cultural custom. I have the strong suspicion that that is really a last-ditch effort, because the wave of human evolution and technology today at a much faster pace, I wonder very often if that's really a lost cause.
I think that's astute. Oftentimes with urban preservation especially, it begins as an act of civil disobedience. If we look at where we are right now in New York City with Soho, for example, and Jane Jacobs. Yeah, I agree with that, actually. I think that's a good observation. What was your question?
I was curious as to how long you came back to the U.S. and what made you leave China.
What made me leave China? I was in Hong Kong teaching, and then we lived in Singapore. I thought I was going to write a book about Singapore. I spent 2 years researching a book about Singapore. There's not going to be a book about Singapore. And then Pittsburgh offered me a job, and I have a young son. And so for us, it sort of became a way to get back. We live in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. Really, Mr. Rogers is from Pittsburgh. So it's sort of a Sesame Street environment. But that's a big question for us now, is how do we get our son back to China? Where is it going to be? So Pittsburgh has a very large Chinese community because of Carnegie Mellon and Pitt. And there's a big Sunday school with Chinese. It's great. The best Sichuan food I've had outside of China is in Pittsburgh. But I think the next book will be about Taiwan, actually. I think that'll be our next way to back into China. Because again, where's the good book about Taiwan? There really isn't one. You were going to say it?
Yeah, how long ago did you come back to the US?
Last year.
Oh, and you were in Chinese.
Yeah.
Why not Singapore?
Singapore, there's a push-pull. Okay. I spent last year, one of the problems with Singapore is that a lot of the good stuff is in queue in the archives in England. So I spent last spring in London, in the National Archives. It's very difficult to get access to a lot of the foreign office reports and stuff like that. My interest in Singapore is that it's always been this landing spot for interesting people. The first Japanese person in America was also the first Japanese person in Singapore. His grave is there. And sort of following these stories of people who have landed. And I got really interested in this, which was all well and good until you talk to a New York-based publisher who goes, no one cares about Singapore. And that's really sad, but true. Yeah, it's a market thing. I still have the goods. In fact, before I left last year, I walked around Singapore. I took 12 days and did the 200-mile loop around it. And it was fascinating. but only to me, maybe, you know? I can't get anybody
Yeah,
else.
we lived there 14 years. So.
It's fascinating, right? When you're there, if you know it, it's fascinating, but it's very difficult. And I should say, you know, the biggest surprise in my life is that these 3 books have an audience on the mainland. They're translated in Taiwan too, but they've all come out in China. And my best graduate student at Hong Kong University translated the Beijing book without telling me. And she started sending it around to publishers. And I said, oh, come on, no one's gonna care about this, or it'll be banned or something. It wasn't. And you know, it's a funny thing, there's not a lot of Chinese nonfiction writing. It's difficult for someone, let's say a professional in their 30s, who need to take care of mom and dad, need to have a house, need to have a job, to say, well, I'm gonna quit and go live in a village for 3 years and write about what goes on there and hope that the government doesn't censor it and hope that I get an advance and hope that it sells and so forth and so forth. There isn't that model there. And so these books actually do quite well in China, which is a big surprise to me. And I wonder, people tell me about Singapore too, is that, well, Singapore people will buy this, they're really interested in their history. But that's why I'm coming back to Taiwan. Maybe there's more of a diaspora there, I don't know. Yeah, go write these books, you guys. I feel like I should be writing about Pittsburgh right now, but I'm still torn. We have all these self-driving Ubers, you know, you can't go anywhere in Pittsburgh without a robot doing something to you, so. It's true. Yeah.
I was interested in what you said about UNESCO
Yeah.
encouraging proposals for.
Yeah.
So are you still involved with advising?
No, and you know why I stopped getting involved with them is the Chinese tourism officials said, this is ridiculous, it's always a bunch of PhDs in suits lecturing to us in English. They're not using Chinese, they don't understand. And I remember really clearly a talk where, because a lot of park managers and UNESCO Heritage Site Management in China come abroad now. They go to Paris, they go to New York and so forth, they see things. And they're saying, like, it's great, the Met can open at nights if it wants to and charge a premium for that, and it can control its flow of people. In China, you cannot change the ticket price. It's set by the central government. You cannot change opening hours. It's set by, you know, and so I just got frustrated too. I thought, I don't want to do this anymore. And now the US has just pulled out of UNESCO, so.
Yeah, so but do you have a sense of, does the central government or provincial governments, how do they respond to that request? And are there initiatives or, you know, and are there interesting things going on?
No, they listened. They took it up with glee, actually. And one of the last sites inscribed is on the North Korean border. So it's the Koguro tombs, which are sort of like ziggurats, and they're on the China side and the North Korea side. And China was very upset that the North Korea side is on the inscription, because of course, in their mind, well, historically, North Korea was part of China and the Ming Dynasty and so forth. But there is that effort is afoot, definitely. One of the things that's sad, like there was talks about the Willow Palisade. I don't know if you've heard of Liu Bian. It was, the Manchu had created a lesser Great Wall that went 1,000 miles up into the northeast, and it was a berm with willow trees planted on it. And it kept separate lands that the Han Chinese could migrate to and where the Manchu emperors could hunt in. And it was mooted as an idea that they could, but there's nothing left. I mean, farmers have dug that up over the years and cut down the willow trees, and that's one of the challenges, is finding things that haven't been torn down. Yeah. Yeah.
I can hear, I'm sure everybody else can, your passion, your love for China. As an American, are you now more Chinese than you're American?
I would never dare say that. Well, that's a really interesting question, because my son is Chinese and American, and we never thought about it, because in Singapore, you're just who you are, it's your name. Singapore's a very multi-ethnic society, they're very proud of it. You know, you learn it in schools, it's in the housing policy. In Hong Kong, it never came up because you're just who you are. In America, now all of a sudden we have forms at doctor's offices. We have forms, are you Chinese? What are you, right? And we've come up with, you know, we're just double. The Japanese call, instead of saying you're half or hyphenated in Japan, you just say you're double. You're both Chinese and American. And in some ways I feel culturally I am. Because it's an odd, it's for an outsider like a school, a kindergarten, they look at me and, oh, you're a white guy, your kid's half Chinese, so you're the American half. And it's like, well, I'm actually in some ways, I know more about China than my wife does. And my wife's a lawyer, she knows a lot more about some parts of America than I do, right? So that's a good question, but I would never, it's sort of heartbreaking. I don't know if some of you feel this way. I don't know when you leave China how to get back in a way. But China can really break your heart too, you know what I mean? Like, I can't go back to Beijing right now because the Beijing I knew and loved, I need to get over that, you know. I need to find a different part of China. Yeah.
What do you miss about China having returned to the United States?
Laughter,
Laughter.
street noise, people touching each other, strangers talking to you. I used to say in China that if you didn't know what you were doing in a place, just stand still, and someone will come and tell you what you're doing. They'll try to sell you something. They'll ask you what you're up to. You know, I miss that because America can be very sanitized. You know, we've been spending more and more time in London. So I teach now half a year in London actually, which is a nice change. And London sort of reminds me of that in a way. You know, there's more street life and it's more involved. But that's the thing I miss. Yeah, I don't miss the bureaucracy, but I miss the. And maybe the optimism too. I have to say, I used to live in New York, and New York, I have a fond spot in my heart for New York. There's Astoria where I used to live. I lived on the Upper West Side too. But Pittsburgh, in a lot of ways, is kind of like Beijing felt in the 90s because everything's new, and everything's really optimistic, and everything's really exciting, and everything's being rebuilt and regenerated, you know, and that's a nice feeling to be around. Whereas when I went to San Francisco last week, it was just like, people are stressed, and it's congested, and it's depressing.
And I did another question.
Yeah.
You said you didn't miss the bureaucracy. What else do you not miss?
Powerlessness. You know, people, I'm really glad you asked that because Chinese will often ask me, you know, like, what's different about American farming from Chinese farming? What's different from American schooling? Or they'll ask me these big, broad questions. And again, my wife, who's a lawyer, will kick me and say, you better tell them it's due process. Because in China, you know, in America, you can fight City Hall for better or for worse. And you look at all the lawsuits that are going on right now against different government actions and so forth. There's a way for citizens to have a voice. And in China, that's sorely missing. Yeah. I remember I interviewed Ai Weiwei, the artist. I went out to his house on June 4th, on the anniversary 1 year. And I said, I don't know, you know, you get cops everywhere outside your house. I really don't want to come out. I'm a little scared. And he said, who the F are you? You're an American writer. You can't let them tell you what to write or what. If you're not going to come talk to me, who will? And he's going on and on and on. And I felt so cowed and sheep, you know, about it. But it is true, even for me as a writer, I find I do self-censor after a while in China. I start sort of towing the line and not wanting to get in trouble or get other people in trouble. Whereas in America, you don't think twice about that. Yeah, in the back.
Yeah. So when you talk in schools in Sichuan, so
Yeah.
what kind of topics students ask you? What kind of things they want to know from you?
Now they want to know all about Beyonce, mostly. You know, that's a really good question because students ask questions that American students would never ask me. They wanted to know about American Indians in America, for example. So they want to know about topics that are, I think, are sort of shunted aside here, or they're in the past, as it were. They wanted to know about equality. They wanted to know about racism. They wanted to know about economic disparity. They wanted to know about women's relationships with their family and so forth, you know, in the workplace and so forth. There were bigger questions rather than, you know, is Michael Jordan the best player or is it LeBron, that sort of thing. It was really inspiring, actually, and motivating to teach. We did these big discussions all the time.
So what kind of a
And
material?
I should say, it felt very odd for me.
Yeah.
I'm not the best person to be answering these questions. And one thing Peace Corps has done a very good job of, I went and spoke to the volunteers last year. They have 120 volunteers coming in annually now. You know, when I got it was 15 of us and 7 left. Now it's 120. They have married gay couples. They have many more African Americans, Asian Americans, half women, half men. The group has become much more diverse than when I went. It was almost all white men from the Midwest, you know, who ended up staying on. So that's a big change there too, to try to represent. The question is, should Peace Corps be in China at all now? That's a big question going on now. You know, Peace Corps has opened a program in Vietnam. It's opening a program in Burma. You know, there's some people in the State Department say maybe the shift should be elsewhere in Asia now.
Yeah. How about say the English kind of materials that you share with your students? Do you have? You can choose whatever you want.
I did, yeah. Yeah, there was no restrictions. Again, as a law lawyer, you get a pass in a lot of ways. You know, someone was asking me, you know, my wife, for example, because she went to law school at Berkeley and she was doing her PhD research in Beijing courtrooms. She would go in and sit in the courtroom. I could go with her. I could take notes. But the minute she started taking notes, the judge said, I can arrest you. We have to have the rules on the wall, you know. And again, it's, well, I'm sitting here And this is why it's hard for Chinese people to do research and writing about their own country, right? That as a foreigner, you sort of get a pass. The worst thing that can happen to me is I get asked to leave. Yeah. Yeah.
Pardon the third question.
Sure.
I have a number of Taiwanese students with whom I had English conversation classes. What is the future of Taiwan? These students, by the way, they're around 35 now with families, and I get the impression from them, very small number of course, I get the impression from them that they don't want anything to do with the mainland.
Mm-hmm.
They feel that a big robbery took place regarding heritage
Yeah.
items, museum things and so forth.
Yeah, and then you go, that's why I'm fascinated in Taiwan. Maybe it's the wrong observation, I always said it's sort of like if the US, if Lincoln had lost the Civil War and fled to Puerto Rico, and kept, the Union on Puerto Rico, and kept all our art and our Constitution and everything there,
Yeah.
and then the mainland was taken over the Confederacy, it's amazing how they soldier on there. I highly recommend it if you haven't been. It changed the way I think about the mainland for sure. Yeah, things that I thought were quote unquote Chinese, it turns out, well, no, it's just the communist way of doing things. It has nothing to do with ethnicity, Yeah. Yes.
What is your perspective on the very epic Asia trip that our leader just took? What do you think? What is your perspective? What do you think the everyday Chinese perspective is on
They
that?
played him like a
theatrical
violin.
performance?
Are you kidding? Oh my gosh, they flattered him, and maybe it's, honestly, if we step back, maybe it's a good thing that the U.S. and China gets along on the surface, and no matter who's playing whom or what's going on. But, when I first went there in '95, they put, Clinton had campaigned by calling them the butchers of Beijing. And then 2 years later, he's being welcomed at Tiananmen Square and clicking champagne glasses. And and there was the WTO and all these things that have gone on, the Belgrade embassy bombing, the protests and so on. It's sort of like, in a weird way, after that trip, I sort of like, well, that's interesting. The US president went to China and nothing happened. There was nothing coming out of it bad. But I think in the Chinese media, if you look at that, they were very happy with the trip and the outcomes. I don't know, Orville Schell went along, and if you look at at China, help me, what's their website?
US China File?
China File. Look at China File. Orville has done, it's F-I-L-E, Orville has done some postings from the trip. He went along. Yeah. There is a faction, I should say, behind the scenes of people who think they can convince Steve Bannon something or other, And I think what's interesting about that is Bannon went to Hong Kong 3 weeks ago, give a big talk, blah, 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 China, China, China. And then the next day was a guest at Zhongnanhai. High. Li Keqiang flew him up to give a private talk behind the scenes. So maybe it's a good thing these things are happening. I don't know. I try to stay out of politics altogether. I really do, because I don't know anything about it. I'm a schmuck. Yeah, one more question.
Oh, the 800 miles with
Yeah.
North Korea.
Yeah.
What sort of monitoring devices are there?
That's an excellent question. Very little, actually. And in some parts, the Yalu River and the Tumen River are shallow enough that you can sort of, when the river's low, you can walk across it. There's little sandbars. And in some parts, there are Korean missions, churches, where they have aid packages that they'll come down to the river at night and throw them over. And the only, I've been in trouble a couple times in China, but the most serious incident I ever had was being hauled into a station in the Northeast and being held and them accusing me of being a missionary. And it was a very funny moment to try to disprove that. And I said, get on your computer, look at Baidu, the search engine, and you'll see that I'm a writer. And they did it, and they saw my books, and they were so relieved, oh, you're a writer, you're great, you're fine, your writers are harmless, because they were so worried about missionary activity. But yeah, it's porous, sometimes it's controlled more often, but there isn't drones flying on it, it's not that level. Yeah, good question.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful talk.
Thanks everybody for coming. I'll stay and talk after.
Thank you. We have copies
Okay,
of the
perfect.
Sleeping
Thank you.
Dragon available upstairs that Michael can sign for you.